we're in. And I need to be able to stay in a conversation with them so that they change their minds about the political environment that we're in. And other tricky things, everything's shifting ideologically every day. And the other thing is like people, there's declining trust. People aren't sure where to turn for trusted news sources, who they can lean onto, and how that they can have conversations that are difficult. So in order to change minds, I always remind myself, we need to create psychological safety, which means we can't shame people. We shouldn't provoke shame. We have to prioritize curiosity and empathy over confrontation. And we have to understand the brain's role in motivating reason and identity protection cognition. And the last thing is that we have to start testing new goals. We really need to be asking ourselves, if we tell stories, did this content change someone's mind? Did it open a conversation? And did it shift what some people see as possible? So that's how I'm coming to this work. And ultimately, how you can be unapologetic and hold and ground things that you believe in without faltering on those. Okay. So I am a Black queer woman who works at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and poverty. I say that wherever I go. And that is not shifting. I'm not lessening that, and not in anything that surrounds me as well. So at my intersections and the things I believe in this world. So I want to just take us to ground us in a definition of narrative that we could hold together today. It's actually from Policy Link. So narrative are the big stories we tell ourselves about the world. They're how we make sense of things. They how we decide what's common sense, how we shape norms. And the most important thing for me in this definition that I'll actually read to you is that by repeating the right narratives, we can create a new tipping point in public consciousness and create the conditions to advance our agenda and broaden our base. So a lot of you have heard maybe the metaphors that if a narrative is the ocean, then a story is a drop of water. You might have also heard if a star is a story, then the constellation of stories is a narrative. And so what we want to do is walk and talk and tell stories that all add up to that constellation that put us on a road towards justice, right? So we are using similar core values and evoking core values in the audiences we talk about, whether we're talking about housing justice, birth justice, racial justice, democracy, diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera, right? So that's a little bit of how I hold a definition. So we're going to do one of my favorite exercises. And so I'm going to ask you to lean into a sensory frame with me. We're going to work on activating, the science behind this is I'm trying to activate both sides of your brain. So in your head, and if you have time and you're able to drop into the chat, what does justice smell like to you? Just take 30 seconds. What does justice smell like to you? The second one, what does justice feel like? I'm watching the chat. I love this. Love that. And the last one, what does justice sound like? Oh, soft wool. I see it. I see it. A warm breeze. And so the reason why I've asked you to take this exercise is one of the things that, and I will say this is in every movement I've ever worked at, and I'm not throwing stones, living in a glass house because I hold it for myself. One of the things that we're really, really good at is telling you everything that's wrong. Like I could tell you, listen, in all the spaces I've worked, I can tell you the horrible stats around maternal health outcomes. I can tell you the horrible stats about housing justice. I can tell you about asthma rates. I can tell you, but then if you stop and ask folks, what does justice smell like? Because you're trying to you're trying to evoke the core emotions that something's irresistible, right? People want to go along with something irresistible. And so to activate and tell stories that ground that. So, for example, when I worked in housing justice, we worked with 52 organizers from across this country to put together a narrative platform and themes for telling stories. And when we first came together, we were like, what kind of stories we need to tell? We talked about the asthma rates, we talked about all those things. And it wasn't until a year after the work, and I'm leading this, right? So, co-leading this, and I'm asking these questions. And I realized that for me, housing justice smells like tomatoes, the smell of tomatoes that lingers on your fingers after you pick tomatoes. And for me, that came because I was raised in Hickson, Tennessee. My mom had gardens. And from what I remember, when I was really little, my job was to help pick the tomatoes. And afterwards, I remember the smell. And that, when I tell you that story, takes you along a journey with me so you know what I mean by justice. Like justice is going to smell like tomato leaves. What is it going to sound like? We work with folks in New Orleans and they were like, it's going to sound like a second line, right? What does it taste like? And has anybody ever smelled something and you're like, that smells delicious. You're combining the taste and all the sensories. And so as you think about the way you tell stories and how you make them irresistible, test with yourself. What does this feel like? What are the core emotions I want people to know what I mean when they smell, right? And telling those stories grounded in that is far stronger than any kind of data that you can list off, et cetera, right? So ground in that to begin. I hit on this before to tell you about the metaphors around narrative. The thing I want to pull out about this is that the narrative, as we think about it as a constellation, is a set of connected stories that shift that shifts what we can see when we shine together. So our goal isn't just to tell better stories individually, it's to connect them so that we create a new constellation of meaning. And that's where power and cultural coherence begin to take space. I'll take you to one more. So I thought that I should leave this in here because a lot of folks spend time thinking about like the difference between narrative, deep messages, stories, and the full aligned infrastructure around narrative change. Some of this I'm just sharing with you so you're grounded in it and I would tell you to know, but I'm not expecting at any point for you to have to be an expert on this, right? So the first part is the narrative, right? That's the highlights, the values, the problems, the cause, the solutions, and the action, right? So the deep narratives really hits on that core emotions that I said, like what's it feel like, smell like? The story is how you tell that, right? It's the count of related events or experiences. There's characters, there's arcs. I sometimes joke what's most important in a story is to land the plane, right? To think about your audience. What did you want to say? And then there's messages, words, images, or sounds that convey the idea or belief. So for anyone who wants to be a better storyteller, someone who wants to be a narrative strategy, I have really good news. All of you are storytellers. Anyone who's ever repeated the tea or loved some gossip and shared some of that with your closest friends, anyone who's read a good night story to a child, anyone who has repeated something at any point, you are all storytellers, right? So you innately are really good at those. The most powerful, persuasive storyteller I know is my daughter. Cameron can talk us into things that I'm like, how did this even happen? She'll go to Amy and say, I'm really thinking we should have sushi tonight. And Amy will be like, huh. And then I talked to Laura about it and she said she really loves spicy tuna. Like we wouldn't have had any of these conversations, but all these facts are indeed true. Then Cameron comes to me and says, I talked to Amy, Maddie, and she knows you love spicy tuna. And she also is down for it. So all of us are persuasive storytellers, right? Some of it is just about honing and connecting those stories together. And for anyone who had questions about the evidence of narrative as a winning tool, I want to just highlight a couple of my favorite, right? And so the first is Say Yes to Second Chances, which came from Desmond Meade for the Florida Voters' Rights Registry. Desmond Meade from Say Yes to Second Chances, that was from Florida. They told stories that allowed for folks who had previously lost their ability to vote to have a second chance, right? And they were able to do this accomplished in Florida to the tune of they used the ballot box to encourage 1.4 million Floridians with a previous felony conviction to be able to vote again. And they won this in 2018 through Amendment 4, and it was a landslide victory. Now, think about the political environment that operates in Florida, right? Tricky in all the different ways. And who would have thought that in Florida, 1.4 million folks with previous felony conviction would be restored to vote, the ability to vote? When you hear Desmond talks about this, he talks about he went out and had conversations with folks all across the board. And what he said to them and the core emotions that he evoked in the storytelling was, have you ever made a mistake and wanted a second chance. And overall, when he tells you, he says he remembers one time when someone was like, yeah, I know someone who made a mistake. They should not have a second chance. One time out of all of his work, right? So the idea that we could have second chances is something that all of us could get behind and move. Free to marry, framed marriage is a rite of passage in our society. Not that you needed to marry, but to be denied the opportunity meant that your fundamental humanity was being disrespected. And one of my favorite pieces in Freedom to Marry, many of us have heard of this, know this work, body of work, and say love is love. One of the things that's really interesting is you look across how they informed their campaign or their work at the local and national and federal levels, is they recognized at a certain point that folks thought that gay folks, queer folks, were asking for a different kind of marriage, a special right, special kind of marriage. And when they realized that, they really said, oh, no, no. Actually, Laura and Amy want to have the same rights you do. We want to have the same struggles you do in marriage. We want to have the same percentage of divorces. I'm being sarcastic, but you follow me. Like all those kind of the things you got, we want that too. You can go see your partner in the hospital. If something, we want to be able to go see our partner. So the recognition that was really critical. One of the tipping points of this was that people weren't asking for something different. They were asking for the exact same thing. And the last one is the Georgia Senate runoff race. So particularly, I think this is powerful from a policy perspective and like how to tell stories perspective as well. So in the wake of the 2020 election, Georgia, a state that hadn't gone Democratic since 1992, had a historic turnout of young Black, Latino, and Asian American voters. Over 800,000 new people registered in the run up to the election, right? And so this was at a time when U.S. Senate runoff between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, and Joan Ossoff and Dave Perdue, which we know went to the Democrats. And one of the things that's particularly interesting in this is the way they looked and examined language. So instead of saying non-voter, right, they switched that language to say a high potential voter. And go with me here, right? It seems like a small thing, but would you want to be known as a non-voter, or would you rather be known as a high potential voter, right? And this is applicable across our fields, right? So if you look at after school programs and opportunity youth, would you want to be known as a high school dropout, or do you want to be known as someone who has their opportunity youth, right? So those pushes on those things that feel like they are language are actually really important. The other thing I'll take us through just quickly is that many times the most of us stay in a narrative system of the status quo, which means we tell stories, repeat stories that reinforce white supremacy. They are grounded in scarcity, individualism, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity. Like we stay in this space. This is the way the majority of the stories are told. But what we know from behavioral science and persuasion perspective, and it's evidence-based as well, is that when you tell stories that are grounded in joyful, pleasurable, abundance, not scarcity, safety and community, sustainability, curiosity, kindness, and the future, folks are more attracted to those stories and are more willing to go on with you, right? And so they're able to craft the future. So I'm asking you to switch from telling stories of scarcity to stories of abundance. And so let me be clear about this. Stories of abundance does not mean that you are saying that everyone has the ability to water their grass anytime they want, no matter what's going on with our water supply and access to clean water. In fact, abundance actually means that we tell stories that say, actually, the systems that we are creating hold all of us so that we can collectively care for each other and make decisions that allow us to provide equitable resources, right? So I think really trying to think about the way you flip stories on their head. I talk about that I am an innately joyful person, and I hope that you feel some parts of that in my style. That does not mean that I'm not immensely angry. That does not mean that I can't be super, super challenging. That does not mean that I am not unapologetic about the things that I believe in the future that I am demanding and working towards. But I also know that folks are attracted to joy, right? They believe in that. And the other thing that's tricky in this time period is if we look at the context in which we're all doing work right now, folks are striving to look for joyful examples, right? Are attracted to, want to know that we are actually winning in some ways, right? And so winning is a tricky one. People are like, Laura, we're winning. And I say, from my perspective as a Black woman, winning never said that we're going to go from A to Z and we're done. In fact, it said we're going to go to A to Z, then we're going to go to D, then we're going to swirl around to J, and then we're going to come back to A. But all we're going to stay on that pathway and know to reinforce and share the stories about what's happening at the local level, all those things that add up. It also allows you to ground in the recognition in this moment in the world that the majority of the world is not actually proud of where we are. The majority of folks are not in support of ICE. Like, so no matter what you may hear on the traditional media, we know that that's not true. So tell stories in that way that the majority of Americans are not happy with separating children from their families, are not happy to put folks in cages, are not like, we don't agree with that. And so tell stories in that kind of way. I'll give you another example of this. This is from the housing justice narrative work that I did. We held as our kind of core theme for all of our storytelling that when we told stories, we were going to tell stories that said, when neighboring is an action, spaces and places become home. So from that, we told stories of love, and love is a verb, love is an action. One of my favorite campaigns from the HINS project, which was did housing justice in St. Paul. The lead organizer said, we are telling stories that when we look outside our window, we look across the street and see our neighbors and not wonder if they're renters or homeowners, right? And so that is like a pretty profound shift in telling stories of love and allowing folks to be able to stay safely in the communities they resided. And they adopted that to tell stories within housing. So the idea that there should absolutely be renter protections because you look at the window, you wanted your neighbors to be able to stay fully, equitably, safely in your community. I'll give you another example that I heard one from safety, privacy, and freedom is a bit tricky for folks sometimes. People are like, safety, privacy. And it was actually from a woman who was part of the Magnolia's Mothers Trust who reflected out that for her, a safe home, and that when she wanted to pull up to her home, pull into her driveway and close the garage door behind her and be able to be her own self in her own private space. Like we can all tell stories that are like, oh, we should be able to have privacy at the same time that we care for our neighbors. Like that is part of the housing story. We can do that, right? So I'll just give that as an example. Okay, Alyssa, I only have 2 more slides and then I'll open up for questions. So anytime I spend time with folks, I try to think about like if there were tactics that I could tell you that maybe you could try on for size. And these are ones that I find to be super accessible and that can be utilized as you tell stories about whatever space that you're working in. One is build trust, right? Connect with your audiences. Know who you're talking to, right? Before you go in, imagine what that audience needs to hear from you to be able to be perceived. Be grounded in yourself. Like people trust folks who show up and say, this is what I believe. And also, this is the space that we're moving towards, right? So connect with your audiences. And you can do that no matter who or where you are. I said, I'm a Black queer woman. I depart tomorrow to go to Texas to give a speech about what I'm going to do. I always start speeches by saying up front, hey, I'm a Black queer woman that's originally from the South. I'm queer. I like live with my wife, Amy, right? And if you got a problem with that, I'm not trying to be less queer for you, right? I'm being authentically who I am, right? So I suggest that always. The other thing is acknowledge complexity. Recognizing that people feel conflicted in this time frame, they feel challenged in their beliefs is really critical, right? And so that doesn't mean that you may agree with all of it, but you can acknowledge, I know this is a difficult time, right? That's another way to successfully message. The third one is calm concerns. So right now, everyone is somatically activated, right? From folks who are like, I don't know what to do. I'm not doing enough. I need to do this. To also to folks who are like, man, feel like I am one person and I'm not sure how to impact what's happening here, here, and here. Like address that. And what we recognize from the behavioral perspective is that when you calm people's concerns, you're actually helping to, when you acknowledge the complexity, you're calming a part of their brain that's like their lizard brain. So if you say to them, I know right now that it's really, really tough out here, and I know that you're feeling super conflicted, people automatically begin to shift into a space that they're more likely to be receptive to your messages because you're acknowledging where they are. Nurture compassion. It's hard times out here for everyone who's here. We have to leave the space for people to be able to change. And that doesn't mean that everyone's going to be your best friend. And it also doesn't mean that you are absolutely talking to the folks that make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, right? So in housing justice, there's actually a small percentage of people that are actually totally your opposition. And there's a bunch of people that are in the middle that just don't know what to do. And you have a wonderful opportunity of taking them on a journey with you to what that might be. And the other thing I do in all everything is activate hope. We have ancestral knowledge. We are able to vision to the future, and we have been able to solve things. That does not mean that we're not in a climate catastrophe, but it does mean that there are opportunities and there are spotlights about things that we can do that we can make a difference. So really activate your hope and share that. So the same things that gets everyone on this webinar up in the morning and you go to work because you believe, share those things. Why are you still doing that work? Why do you believe that all children should have a safe start to the world? And that begins with birth centers. Why do I believe in racial equity? What does that mean for places and people I love, right? Activate that hope. And the last slide is, this was a little bit about this is adapted from some work that came out from a group that I really respect, Worthy Strategy Group, that talked about what are the things that capture people's brains, right? And so I thought about, I should share these with you as well. Some of them overlap a little bit, but think about it. I'll start with the top right, which is surprise. So anytime you tell someone, oh, you want to know something surprising? You actually hijack their brain. The brain is automatically like, did you say surprise? I love a good surprise, right? Most of the time, humans spend time thinking and listening to reinforce what they already know. When you interrupt that by saying, I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you, people are they're disalarmed and they're like, and they lean into that. So think about that. Higher purpose. When you share your higher purpose, make people feel special and then tell them what you're willing to die for, right? And it doesn't have to be to die for is that dramatic, right? But I was on a call with youth climate activists, and they shared with me. They said, this is something I'm willing to die for, and here's what it is. And I was like, well, damn, that is a higher purpose. I want to make sure that I'm exuding that and bringing folks into that as well. That hope, which we talked about before, people need to feel it from the physical to the emotional and to their identity level, right? Community. We can look around us, and this is a time in which we are leaning into our neighbors, spaces and places at the local level, and also recognizing what these connections need and what they can foster. If you look at all the way from Marvel Comics, from Batman had Robin, all the way to Chichuri had T'Challa, T'Challa had Zuri. Like, we are in this piece where community is being echoed around us. We're talking about leaderful movements, right? And so talk about what being a part of community can and does for your work. Always make a personal touch, make people feel special, right? They want to know what's in them. All humans, good, bad, ugly, in between. The first thing we think is like, what's in this for me? Make people feel special in that. You have a special role in this. Abundance, as I talked about a little bit before, the value of an opportunity that connects us to one another and how we can hold that. In immersive experiences. So the richer stories you can tell, the more that you can evoke core emotions, the stickier opportunities that you create for people to attach to something, the more likely that they're going to increase touch. I'll give you one example of this. So I have a really dear friend that in lots of ways, we have a lot in common. In lots of ways, we don't. So when first Roe v. Wade was being argued, she came to me and said, we don't have any rights at all. And so my first thought was like, oh, you just waking up? Like, we don't got no rights at all? Like, this is something new to you? And then I decided, Laura Hughes, don't be your usual catty self. Recognize that this is an opportunity and a moment for me to share with her what's happening in housing justice, what's happening with midwifery, she is adjacent to my movement, but I need to give her an experience so she feels like here's a sticky connection that I can dive in and have a role to and see the connections. Okay, so that's just one example there. So I think, Alyssa, if that feels good, I'll stop sharing for now and open it up for questions and really a conversation. If there's tactical things I can give you, if none of this made sense, I'm down for that too. Let me know what you're thinking and how we could dive in together.
Well, I have a lot of questions, Laura, but I'm going to hold back. And that was just so incredibly helpful. I mean, I just feel like I don't know if other folks on the call want to chime in, and please feel free to turn your video back on and join us for questions. Would love to see some faces and hear your thoughts and reflections. But I want to just I want to just acknowledge I don't know the last meeting I was in where while we were drafting paragraphs and paragraphs about what how our values resonate in the work or potential storytelling frames, who actually was like, I wonder what justice smells like. What does it smell? What does birth justice, look like for all of us? Like it's really true. I think we don't pull ourselves out of um the work sometimes to focus on narratives in the way that we should. And also want to acknowledge that a lot of that is funder centric, right? Like we don't always get to go to that place because we're asked to show up in other ways. All right. Well, I want to open up to questions. Does anyone have a first question? Do you want to raise your hand or unmute and chime on in, or feel free to throw it into the chat? What's coming up for you in today? What are you thinking about within your own work, and what questions do you have for Laura? All right. Elena Laswick, go ahead.
Hi. Hi, Laura. Thanks so much for sharing. And I think that it's really great to hear such a positive perspective and think about these things really positively, especially now. And so I think a lot of this advice is really good and like good for our souls as well to think about things in this way and to frame things in this way. I'm coming from the nonprofit sector, of course, probably a lot of us are, or all of us are. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, I feel like a lot of times we frame things in this kind of like terms of scarcity, right? So that we feel like we're competing for resources. We're located in Guatemala, and a lot of places here are competing for specific funders. There's not a lot of foundations, for example, organizations or people who may want to give, and maybe a lot of times people are currently focusing on causes closer to home right now in this political climate. So one of the things that we're really, I think, worried about and trying to figure out how to react to and kind of bracing ourselves for is this idea of, okay, there's only a pot of 100, and what if 99 of those dollars start getting directed elsewhere? What if everyone's telling these really compelling stories, right? And like, instead of maybe framing it in the way of competing, like what would be a good framework for us to think about ourselves in this landscape, right, of a lot of people with all of these great causes, things that they would die for, but we're all competing for those same resources. Like, what would you say in terms of um, kind of preparing ourselves mentally for that, or using your narrative in a way that is also kind of saying like, hey, we realize that there's all of these 100 things that you could be giving money to, like, but you should still choose us. Yeah, hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, totally. Um, yes. Okay, so let me okay, I'll try to be concise with it, which isn't always my strength. Okay, so think about this one example of scarcity, right? So you go into CVS and they say you can get five of these for $10, but the limit is five. And next thing you know, you're like, shit, I gotta call my wife. She gotta come too because she can buy five, I can buy five. And then next thing I know, we come home with 20 things of we called in, like Lemmy, my dog bought, we come home with 20 sunscreens for the summer and we're like, what? Why did we need this? Something triggered in us, right? So what I think that we're trying to hold within all of our work, I would suggest, is that you're not triggering that, right? Like you don't want people to like then get lots of things that they actually don't need. And I didn't need to do that, right? That's easy, right? For like the sunscreen example, right? The other thing is like, think about the future that we're all holding. I don't even know everyone on this call, but all of us are holding philosophically in the future. Do you see there's winners and losers? Like, do you want someone to win and someone to lose? Right. And some people are like, Laura, I'm cool with that. Like, and I'm like, okay, but like, is that the future we're doing? Right. So I'm just suggesting those frames as you think about it. The other thing is that you can hold abundance and urgency, I see in the chat as well, right? By making connections to why your work is part of all of our work, right? A part of a justice movement, how this applies, right? And you can name specifically for folks, here's what I need for you to do. So like my friend who was like really, upset that we no longer have rights. I said, that's true. And we have to do work there. And I also need for you to do X in support of midwifery. I need for you to do X. So there is not only like a hope gap, right? Which means that some of us are able to think towards like what it looks like when we ultimately win, when like thriving means I kick back on the beach, right? Like, I don't know, we won't get there in my lifetime because there's so many things, but we're able to see, like some people are able to craft that. The way to hold abundance and your specific work is to name and take people on the baby steps about what you need for them to do now. So that doesn't, your baby step would never be like, I need you to give money to me and not that person, unless it's your opposition. Still, that's a different strategy for a different day, right? But like, so you can give a baby step on the journey, and that does not mean that you're undercutting the other work that's also happening. Does that make any sense? It's not perfect, but it is a tactic that I'm suggesting you try.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think ultimately though people might say like I have $5, and and I can't give you all five of them and that's okay. We just have to look for four other people who can give $1. Yeah.
Yeah, and I
I
think,
hear you.
Elena, to your question too, Laura, just to add from the kind of
Yes.
resource mobilizing side of things is I think this is where again, in my experience of working with Laura, is that collective narrative across an ecosystem, like all of the
Mm-hmm.
organizations supporting children in Guatemala coming out and saying what they need to say to philanthropy makes us realize that there's also abundance. So I think that that's where the collective storytelling, I think sometimes we stay away from that in the nonprofit sector. We talk so much about impact and the stories of the individuals and the families and the communities that we're supporting, but we don't challenge some of the larger structural things and how it impacts how we actually get our work done, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
all of these, like, we know economic justice and other racial injustices that all wrap around why we're stuck in this narrative as well. So sometimes, really powerful collaborative, not we all want money from you necessarily, the same entity you're taking it on, but like a collaborative storytelling effort of like for the next month, 10 NGOs with us in Guatemala are going to share our stories of seeking funds and what impact it's had on us as individuals trying to do this work in the field, so to speak, I think can be really
Mm-hmm.
powerful. So I don't know,
Yeah.
Laura, if you want to build on that, but
No.
that is important narrative work too.
Spot on. I just was able to co-host 26 midwives and birth centers from across this country that came together for the first time, formally in this setting, to talk about what stories they could tell collectively together. And that doesn't mean that all of them aren't serving different populations or doing things slightly different, but it does mean that they're walking lock and step, particularly with funders, and saying, this is what we need from a birth justice movement, right? And so I think and as resources get tighter and as philanthropy does its continued thing, you'll need to have that united approach, right? And also, the world and our cultural strategy is moving towards that united front. So that's why I told you, like, the Batman and needs Robin, right? Like, you're in it together. So, and you're going to have to push on philanthropy. I know that philanthropy creates all kinds of things, and just all kinds of things. But Alyssa, you are spot on. And I think the other thing I'll say about making sure you don't fall into a white supremacy like mindset. So like right now, I'll tell you, I do work across the South, and voting rights is, oh my goodness, I'm losing all kinds of sleep, right? And I know fantastic people who are doing work and are fighting. And I know people who've been doing this work and setting the table for power building for the last 20 years, so that when we got to this moment, they could automatically deploy and get resources towards the next things that needs to happen. A white supremacist response is all of us on this call throwing up our hands in panic and saying, oh my God, we all have to go and rush and do this, this, and this, right? The urgency is only here. Instead of recognizing that all of your work contributes towards multiracial democracy, contributes towards a just future. So in some ways, I'm like, keep doing what you do so spectacularly well, but do it in coordination so that folks in North Carolina know what's happening in Louisiana, know what's happening in California. That's how we tell a coherent story together. But we're not also throwing up our hands in a panic mode, because that's really what our opposition organization wants us to do, and that's what we're used to doing. So that's like one example of how to not respond with that kind of urgency and scarcity that makes you crazy. And next thing you know, you're pulling out your eyelashes. Okay, so if you feel like you're pulling out your eyelashes and you run around, like, deep breath, also make sure that you're pulling from that space. Okay.
Yeah, so Laura, I want to honor Emily's question. Emily, I don't know if you want to unmute and chime on in, totally up to you, but how do you think about balancing urgency with not getting caught up in that scarcity mindset? I think is a really good question. I know you have other things to add to that question, Emily, as well from your specific work. But yeah, Laura, any thoughts on addressing that? I'm curious how you hold that piece.
Okay, we see you're not a, yeah. I think the other thing is that everything that we have loved and built as this country has been because we have been able to operate at multiple horizons. It is the superpower of so many progressive folks I love. We have been able to hold the urgency in this moment as well as our long-term vision. And there's some of us that are emergency response, disaster response, right? And then there are some of us that say, I got your back, I'm supporting you, you call me, and I'm going to keep doing this work that I do too. So I really suggest that folks think about the horizons in which you operate and also know that you can bob and weave in those horizons, right? But the important part of narrative strategy that I think is this collective long-term narrative storytelling that supports all of us, that goes towards this future, and all of our stories connect to that North Star for the American South, right? If we point towards that North Star, why that's really important is because then it allows you to come out to say, in this moment, I have to tell this story. I have to respond urgently in this moment, but I'm going to make sure what I respond to urgently in this moment does not detract from the direction that we're going long term, right? And so we don't want to accidentally undermine ourselves for the direction we're going long term, right? And I can give lots of examples in which we didn't look across the horizons that exist. So like kind of one horizon is what we're in right now. Sticky one is what we're transforming to, right? And the third one is when we get there, right? That's the ultimate transformation. And we will take some parts of what we have today into the middle, right? And we probably won't just go from what we have today to the transformational future tomorrow. Like it doesn't work. Like if I had a magic wand, we would have already done it. So we're going to have to be in this sticky space in the middle, the second horizon, where we hold the long term and respond with urgency. And we know how to do that. We actually know how to do that. That's the thing I would just respond to there, if that helps a bit.
So I have two questions, and again, I just want to open up to folks to add into the chat any questions that come up for you. But I know there's a few organizations on today's call who hold that tension of having divided audiences right now that are supporting their work, volunteering for them, serving on their boards. You know, the organization that maybe on one side folks love them in the community because they provide childcare to folks, but on the other side they're doing work that is in the DEI landscape, and so there's the racial component, right? So you hold that container of like folks that are sort of there for what I want to say is like the social service work, right? Like I see right now in the there's a lot of tension I've felt right now for folks in the food security versus food justice. What are you actually doing? What does that mean over here? Right. And so I'm curious, Laura, what your sort of reaction is to that. And for folks who are storytelling in communities where they're like, okay, we really have a divided or polarized audience and a lot of diverse supporters, how do you hold that and how do you stick to the narrative that you want to share while also being mindful in this landscape? Like we've had folks afraid of the legal ramifications and it's just a very tricky landscape. So curious what your thoughts are, and I obviously have my own, but I'm really grateful to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. My heart. That means I feel it very deeply and I am with you. And maybe this might or may not be popular, but it's an opinion. Wrestle with me, see what you think. So a couple of things in this moment is we as a nation know how to keep doing work, even if we can't say the exact same words, right? Um, and so that's a tricky posture. And I'm not trying to say that lightly. So if you have to, there's some places that do not have to see language. Like some of the folks I work with, I'm like, listen, I need for you to stop louder. Like you ain't got to see nothing. You're not going to lose any. So if you If it is scary, you are not alone. If you are worried, you are not alone. And if you do not have to cede language, do not cede language. What we need in this time is more people to stand up and stand strong. That does not mean that I'm asking you to put yourself in danger. It does not mean that I know that some of us operate at intersections and feel things much closer to home than some folks do. I also strongly believe that those who are operating closest to the challenges are closest to the solutions. So there are some of us that will need to adjust, and there are some of us that can stand. And I say that like if I'm in a room with philanthropy, I'm like, what? You better not. You better. You got a resource of time to all the things. Do that, right? Um, the other thing is I encourage folks to think really clearly on who your audience is and who you're talking to at what moment. And if you thought about you have an elevator speech, like what's the one thing that you want for them to take away from this? The one thing that you want them to go tell someone else, right? And so I'll give you an example, food security and food justice, like the language. Okay, first of all your language should be written at a sixth grade reading level, and you should be holding two audiences. One, my mother, who's 82, and second audience is my niece, who's 16, right? Those are the two audiences. And that's really hard, right? But ultimately, does my 82-year-old mother know the difference between food security and food justice? Does she need to know the difference between food security and food justice? Now, this made me hella unpopular, and I'm really a lovely human being. So if you hate that, give me a second chance, stay with me. But I said something no different than like community midwifery versus midwifery. Like, does the average person if you're persuading whoever the average person is, if you are persuading someone who is progressive on all issues, do they need to know the difference between community midwifery and midwifery? Maybe, maybe not, right? So I think sometimes when we're doing this work, we get so caught up in language. And I'll use one for DEI. And I've worked at racial justice organizations. If I can look back on the number of times that we redrew the racial equity ladder, for years we've been trying to do new drawings of ladders and handholding to demonstrate what racial equity meant. Does that mean that we are slightly missing the forest from the trees? Were we not, it's always easy in retrospect to think about like if I'm redrawing the ladder, is my language landing in a way that people can resonate with? Like, so just like interrogate what you're holding. And if you told me it's hella important that they know the difference between food security and food justice, I'm like, let's do it. Tell me who you're talking to, what they currently believe. And some of you will have lots of data about this. And some of you have had a Thanksgiving dinner where you didn't agree with your cousins. And so you know how to be in a room with someone that you don't hate who doesn't agree with you and not blow up Thanksgiving dinner. Or maybe I'm the only one blowing up dinner with my opinions on things, right? But you are able to picture that person, think about what makes them work, what makes them tick, and what they're interested in. Speak to that to them. Okay. So I hope that helps, Alyssa. And Alyssa, tell me, what would you add to that? What would you challenge me with?
No, I mean, I really think it's spot on. I think the thing that I struggle with sometimes in work is in messaging work is how the process by which decisions are made of who's telling the narrative, right? So I feel like you and I have had this conversation before of sometimes it's top down. It's like, oh, the ED and the board are deciding on what language is going out in materials, and it's not actually sourced from like community and who is benefiting from and part of the actual work. So I find that interesting too. Like, how do you facilitate the process in these times? I can't tell you how
Mm-hmm.
many organizations have been like, we just have to hurry up and get something out. And I'm like, but you haven't talked to like the top tier key players. Like you're just
Oh yeah.
right. So I don't know if you can comment on that, but spot on. And all I would add is the process by which you collect these stories, right? Like who needs to
Yeah.
be the one to tell you what justice feels like because they're seeking it, right? It's just
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. No, I hear you. So my work is always grounded in movement. And so when I say that those who are closest to the challenge are closest to the solutions, that's not hyperbole for me. I believe that, right? And I know it to be true, right? And so I think like always holding the folks that like I believe in servant leadership, that you're working on behalf of, or you're working alongside, or a lot of times in my work, Alyssa, I would say my job is to open a door, step aside and be quiet and let the folks who came in the door with me talk. Like do some self-interrogation about how you hold in this space, particularly because the environment is wild out here. Other thing is ground yourself, right? Like really there's so many things. Like I do a somatic shake before I get in difficult conversations. Like literally I do like the whole I'm like, let me ground, right? And think about who you're having that conversation with and what you need to say to move them. that's unapologetically true and grounded in yourself, right? And people are listening, looking for that authenticity, right? But to your point, like, and all of you are storytellers, and you should be telling stories about your work all the time, like all the time. You should have elevator speech. You should have the speech you tell your next door neighbor, and practice. One of my favorite. I went to a training, and they were like practice in an Uber, and I was like, "Ooh, Lord!" They're like, "If you really want to know what people think about it, practice in an Uber and see what the Uber driver tells you." Listen, I'm not mad at it, right? Keep trying, right, to tell these stories, connect them, bring in your work, try to really practice on holding abundance. It's easier said than done, right? Require yourself to not tell a story in a detrimental fashion. Look up the work of Travian Shorters, right? Like asset-based language, like try them on for size, right? Keep trying. And then decide, like, if you have to seed language, if you need to use something else, or if you're going to be like lots of folks who've navigated across all of our time period, who've been like, nope, I'm not going to seed that. I'm going to say it anyway. Do that too.
Mm. I love that. I always make the joke in a lot of the trainings that I'll do, Laura, that I literally like it's my grocery store pitch. Like I always try to do like I'm in the cereal aisle and I bump into someone I'm not expecting who I think could be part of movement and I'm like, "Oh, hey, what do I say in my 30 seconds?" Like and I think it's also really important. I did just want to touch upon one thing that you shared about making it irresistible to be a part of the abundance narrative, right? Like make it irresistible. And honestly, like I think that's why on days that are really tough with the negative things that we're receiving, and we're trying to process and move forward. It's the stories of resilience that folks who over time kept the heartbeat of those stories going that is inspiring that we can still be a part of. And so I just want to thank you for like bringing us back to it because that felt really important to me to like say, okay, I've got my window with you. Like you really want to be a part of this. Here are the narratives as to narratives as to why. Um, so, my last question of you before we sign off today is if you are an organization leader that participated in today's time and really thinking about the messaging and the narrative work at your organization, what do you feel like are like the handful of things that you should get off this call today and put in your project management tool to do before the weekends? Things to assess, things to look at, a couple people to talk to. Like, what are some action items to take building off of today?
Um, a couple of things that to the tune. One is it may feel a little out of whack, but try on for size with your colleagues and your peers. What does whatever you're working like feel, smell, and taste like, right? Try it as an exercise just to see what comes up for folks. You're activating different sides of the brain, but you're also, it's a natural space to unearth like what are the core emotions you could evoke that people gravitate towards, right? So I would encourage you to try it, see if it works for you. The other side of it is to think about who you're talking to, right? So know who your ideal person is that you're moving, right? And ideal doesn't mean ideal. Like it's like you're going to go into this meeting and you need to move X, Y, and Z person, right? You know that they're from the South. They believe in this, this, and this. They also have a biracially adopted daughter. Like you have all these kind of things that you've unearthed and learned about folks. Think about that. And Alyssa, you've taught me this so clearly, and I know everyone knows this, but have your elevator speech tight. Make sure that it articulates the aspirational future that you're moving us towards. Even if the step you take, the next step is an urgent response. Make sure, take people on the journey. What we are looking for is more people who can tell us where we're going that we trust and that can create baby steps for us to be able to go along with them, right? That's what people need. Um, and the other side of it is like, stay in it. You're absolutely not alone. Um, there are so many folks who are wrestling with how to tell stories in this time period. And, Alyssa, as like, the same way I call Alyssa, I'm like, I got something to ask. I'm here for you. If I can be helpful in any way, so Alyssa, I'll send her some follow-up materials, right? But those are the three kind of things I would say try on for size. And they are urgent, particularly in this moment, which may feel like in some ways you're like, that's what she's going to tell me to do in this moment, right? In this exact moment. And yes, because those are the things that are going to allow you to take people with you.
I think Laura, you and I were talking at one point, and you shared I think we were talking about another body of work and just how the other thing that fundamentally right now is no one's feeling into anything. And as we deepen into this like AI sort of landscape, like Like even just looking in the chat, like you need to bring, I love the immersive experience piece. Like we do a lot of that at Wright Collective. Like our work is shaping experiences for people to feel into what's possible, right? Like that, like social imagination, like light it up. We need to stay on that trajectory. So I'm just so grateful, I don't know, to host a webinar at lunchtime in June, 2 days before my birthday. This is my like Gemini, I'm in my Gemini month. Um, where I got to see people type in like clean air and fresh rain and soft wool and all these things and feel into the possibility of creating that world. In a time where I think on some days it feels like it's either not possible or sliding backwards. And I'm just grateful for you for reminding us that narrative is long-term ongoing work. And yeah, we need to do it together. So I want to really encourage folks to reach out to Laura to learn more about her work. I want to thank you all for taking the time today to invest in your very important selves and the movement work that you steward. And please stay in touch. We'll send out an e-blast a little later this week with the recording and Laura's contact information. And I'm always a big gratitude fan. So if you want to throw gratitude in the chat for anything that you heard or witnessed or thought of today, please do so as you're signing off. And thank you for being with us. Our next webinar in 3 weeks is on cybersecurity for nonprofits. So shall we continue the theme of just continue to think in these times how we take care of ourselves, take care of our communities, and stick to the truth that we know is the work that we're all leading. So thanks for being here. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, everyone. See you guys later. Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you. That was awesome.